A common question I get is, am I taking too much risk in my portfolio or not enough? It's a really great question because anytime you're investing in a mix of stocks and bonds, you'd expect your portfolio to rise and fall with the overall market. But how much stock exposure you have within a portfolio is really going to drive how much risk you're exposed to. Risk and return are really closely related, one of the most important concepts in investing. And so when we sit down with clients, we try to go and assess their risk tolerance, which is really made up of two components. One is ability, which is very objective, and one is willingness, which is highly subjective. Now, ability to tolerate risk, that's driven by things that are very measurable, such as time horizon. So the longer the time is that you need the money between now and when you need the money, whether it's a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, that's gonna increase your ability to tolerate risk. Similarly, if you have low liquidity needs relative to the size of your portfolio, that's going to increase your ability to tolerate risk. So for example, if you have a $10 million portfolio and you're 70 years old and you're only spending $100,000 a year, well gosh, you're not really drawing that much from the portfolio value, and your ability to tolerate fluctuations in the value of your portfolio is very high. On the other hand, if you have $1 million portfolio and you're age 65 and you're spending $250,000 a year, you really have no ability to lose risk. And by the way, you also didn't save that well. But so two things we've talked about: time horizon, liquidity needs relative to the size of the portfolio. A third thing that goes into ability is your human capital or your earnings potential. So people in their 20s, 30s, 40s have higher earnings potential than someone in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And from an ability to take risk standpoint, that's important because as your portfolio value falls, you lean on your income and give your portfolio time to recover. Whereas if you're a retiree and you don't really have a lot of earnings coming in, then when a portfolio falls, you're forced to liquidate at lower prices in order to support your lifestyle. So having high human capital, which is really just earnings capacity, increases your ability to tolerate risk. Having a lower earnings capacity decreases your ability to take risk. The final thing is goal flexibility. So really here, I'm talking a lot about retirement because most people, when they're investing, even if they're not entirely sure why they're investing their money, the primary goal ends up being retirement. Other common goals can be investing for your kids' education, maybe a dream home or a dream vacation. But generally speaking, here's a good rule of thumb. If you can't tolerate significant losses and you know that you need the money within 5 years, there's a pretty good chance you shouldn't have stocks in your portfolio. And if you do, it should be very, very minimal. But once you have 10, 20, 30 years until a goal, that ability to tolerate risk is quite high. Now, the flexibility of that goal is also important because let's say you're funding your child's education. The 4-year window in which they're going to college is pretty much locked in. Whereas if the goal is retirement, you could be willing to wait an extra year or an extra 6 months to retire later. There is a little bit of flexibility there. Or if there isn't flexibility in the time at which you are retiring, if there's any sort of lifestyle flexibility, like the amount of income that you want to withdraw from the portfolio, well, that's another thing that can increase flexibility. So those are really the pieces that go into ability to tolerate risk. Willingness is more subjective. There's a number of ways we can measure it. One is risk tolerance questionnaires, which is really just a series of questions to try to quantify some of your feelings about risk. There's pros and cons to this approach, but I'll say more commonly, we really trust the conversations that we're having and knowing to ask the right questions to try to dig in to what really gets you to tick. How nervous are you about market swings? Another interesting thing is to look at your existing holdings, your existing statement, and see what allocation you have today. Because if you have a stock-heavy allocation today, well, that tells me you have some experience with risk. But I could also ask, well, what were you doing in 2007 and 2008 when markets were falling? That's a very telling question. Sometimes profession helps us gain a little insight into into willingness to tolerate risk. So a tenured professor, doesn't have a lot of cash flow fluctuation, but an entrepreneur who has started businesses and taken a lot of risk with their finances probably has a stomach for some of this stuff. And these aren't hard rules. These are really kind of guidelines, and every situation is different on the willingness side. Again, that's why it's highly subjective. The two together is what helps us arrive at what a good asset allocation is given what your goals are, what your ability and willingness to tolerate risk is. Taking too much risk is a problem because when markets fall, it gets scary and you're more apt to do something wrong. And really the key to investment success often is just avoiding mistakes and avoiding actions that would interrupt compound interest. And making movements with your portfolio just because the market's going up or down typically is one of those things that's going to interrupt compound interest in a negative way. Another thing is if you aren't taking enough risk, well, then your savings rate might have to be unrealistically high to meet your goals. Because investing, you really want to grow your assets at a rate greater than inflation without taking undue risk. And if you are just saving in cash, you're going to have a pretty high savings rate in order to meet your goals. And quite frankly, it's pretty unrealistic to expect anybody to meet those goals. I hope this is helpful, and thanks so much for watching.